Okay, we are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. We're still in chapter 18. That may or may not change after. I think we'll be done with chapter 18, maybe just barely after today. We actually have gone through most of chapter 18. In fact, we're pretty close to the end as far as number of verses go of that chapter. Of course, this chapter is most famous for the part we looked at last week where Elijah has a face-off against the 450 prophets of Baal on the top of Mount Carmel. And we've kind of talked about the setup to this kind of in the week before, but I'll kind of mention it here just for context. Elijah was told at the beginning of chapter 18 to go back to Israel to present himself to Ahab, and God, I assume, gave him these very specific directions. Otherwise, Elijah's really come up with something interesting here by himself. I don't know how creative he would be. But through the events of that, we ended up here on Mount Carmel. You have all of the Israelites have been called to gather here to kind of witness this event. And you have Elijah by himself on one side and the 450 prophets of Baal on the other side. And Elijah is basically making the claim, whoever is the true God, we should serve him, and here's how we're going to determine who the true God is. And they are basically each going to offer a sacrifice to their respective God, but they're not going to light it on fire. Whichever God sends fire from heaven, that's the God, that's the one we're going to worship. And Elijah very much gives the prophets of Baal every opportunity to make their side win if they could. He gives them, the choice of which bull they want. They get to go first. They have all day. They start in the morning. We're not exactly told when in the morning, but they start all day. By the time we get to noon, Elijah is just kind of making fun of them, but also at the same time making it look like their God is not really that powerful. But like either they got to follow his taunts or they don't and just give up, but they can't do that. So they get more and more ridiculous. They're dancing around. They're hollering. They're cutting themselves. It's just ridiculous. Like I assume they must have done it in shifts. I can't imagine all 450 go for like 8 hours at all in one go. I don't think I could do that. But by the time the evening sacrifice comes, nothing has happened. They've wasted everybody's time. What a waste of a day. You could really just go and watch paint dry, and that probably would have been a lot more productive of a time than watching these prophets of Baal trying to call fire from heaven. It never happened. So by the time we get to the evening sacrifice, Elijah says, okay, enough of this. Come here to me. He rebuilds the altar to the Lord that had been torn down, 12 stones. He prepares the sacrifice. He digs a kind of moat or trench around it, and he tells them to pile on water, get water all over the sacrifice, all over the wood. We have 4 jars, and they do it 3 times, and so you get 12 jars worth of water. It fills up the whole trench, in fact. So this thing has just been completely doused, and if anybody knows anything about fire, it is hard to light something that has been just kind of smothered in water. You can't burn that. It's pretty much impossible. But Elijah, all he does is he prays to God. Real quickly, about 1 verse later, there's fire from heaven. God does it immediately, no delay, and it burns up the sacrifice. It burns up the wood, which has all been doused with water. It burns up and takes away the stones and the soil that is in the area. All the water in the trough is gone. So this is more than just somebody had, some fire that they lit. This is truly a miraculous thing. Elijah has made it very clear that no man could do this thing. Only God, only something with supernatural power could have done something like this. So that solves all the problems. Israel is going to be devoted to God from here on out. There's never going to be a problem in Israel anymore, right? We're going to find that's not really true. That should be the case. This should have been the finality of it. And this is one of the things where people say, well, if God just showed me a sign, I would believe in him. Well, here's the sign, and guess how many Israelites went home later that day and decided, nah, I'm not really interested in serving God. A whole bunch, because we never see, any huge change in Israel's culture, any shift toward serving God. You have individuals. You do not have the wider nation saying, hey, we need to get rid of these Baals. We need to get rid of these Ashtaroth, these idols. We need to serve God only. That never happens. Even though there's been this huge display that change never happens. And I can only imagine that's because the hearts of the people are just not interested in serving God. They're interested in serving their own ideas, despite what's happened. I mean, they can't deny this has happened, but they're willing to serve their own interests first. But in the moment, Elijah is able to command the people to seize the 450 prophets of Baal. They have them all slaughtered at Elijah's direction. So not only do the prophets of Baal lose, they also die. Because, I imagine if you wasted my day too, I'd be pretty angry. But it's more than that. These are false prophets. They need to die. This is in accordance with what God continually says about people who prophesy falsely or, say things that don't come to fruition, is they're just liars. So we get rid of them. And that's where we left off last week. Any comments, questions? I guess that's up to verse 40. Anything we need to touch on before we finish off the chapter? Go ahead, Jeff.
Elijah's one man. He doesn't have a bunch of prophets with him or anything like that. He's one man.
Mm-hmm.
So the people, as you said, they don't really turn to God like they should. There should have been a cultural shift, a change in paradigm, and everything was different. And we've learned through history that it doesn't matter what kind of army you have, it doesn't matter how big a military you have. If the people turn against you and are sufficiently, there's sufficient unrest, you can't hold the government together. We've seen that many times over in different parts of the world. Even the enigmatic way in which America beat the British, we didn't really beat the British, but just the circumstances were such, we didn't win very many battles. We won a few, the ones that mattered, and the British gave up. But it's really interesting. The people went home because they didn't want to lose what they had. You talked about their self-interest. They didn't want to jeopardize. They had fashioned their farm, their life, their business, whatever, and they didn't want to jeopardize, take a chance on losing that. And that is a great reminder to us in our country today, because unrest is ahead of us. We know that. What are we going to do if the unrest threatens to cause us to lose our home or something such as that? There should be nothing so precious to us that we would jeopardize or compromise the cause of the Lord. And anyway, Jezebel now has lost 450 prophets. How should she think about that?
We're going to talk about that in the next chapter.
This is part of the fact that nothing changes. One prophet, one by himself, and she doesn't believe in the God he represents, defeats 450 of the prophets that she believes really represent God, her God, Baal. And it's really amazing how much we so want to keep what we have. We gather what we can, and we want to keep what we have, and we will not give it up no matter what. And it's just a big reminder for us today, because we may have decisions like that in our life today.
Yeah, and there's several ways we can look at that. People are kind of obstinate, don't like to change. Once they're set in a certain way, that's the way it's going to be. And I don't know if that's necessarily part of what's going on here, but we see examples throughout the New Testament of people who are being challenged in their beliefs, and some do repent and change and turn to the Lord, but a lot don't. You look at the Pharisees and all the scribes, that Jesus is over and over proving that their hypocrisy and saying all the things that they're doing wrong, and they can't argue against him. They can't find a way to find Jesus at fault or anything like that. So they should be convinced by what Jesus is saying, but they're not, by and large. We do have a few, like I think Nicodemus would probably be an exception to that. Nicodemus seems to believe and trust in what Jesus says, but by and large, most of them don't. And we go to like a story in Acts chapter 19, when Paul goes to Ephesus, and there's the silversmith Demetrius, who he's worried that we're going to have all these Christians now. We're not going to be able to sell our wares because, who's going to buy these idols that we make? He doesn't want to lose that economic source that he's got going. So there could be all sorts of reasons why people would not turn to God, whether it's pure selfishness or obstinance or desire for physical things or whatever it may be. But I think we need to understand that just, and Jesus, of course, had miracles in his time that many people witnessed and still didn't believe. A miraculous sign alone does not change someone's mind. Now, it should, in some way, cause them to at least doubt, like, hey, maybe I should be thinking more about this. But it seems by and large, when we continue through, 1st and 2nd Kings, the nation of Israel doesn't really change on account of this instance, which is baffling. I mean, they can tell that only God could have done this. Elijah made the terms very clear, and yet people go home and what? Well, nothing really changes. And that's kind of the sad half, I guess, of this story is the lack of change. And in fact, we're going to see Elijah's going to be in some real difficulties coming up in the next chapter. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't finished 18 yet. Any comments up through verse 40? Okay, let's attempt to finish this chapter. We'll do my best here. It's just 5 verses. Someone read for us verses 41 through 46, please.
Then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. Then he bowed down on the ground and put his face between his knees, and said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked, and said, "There is nothing." And 7 times he said, "Go again." Then it came to pass the 7th time that he said, "There is a cloud as small as a man's hand rising out of the sea." So he said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. So Ahab rode away and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel.
Okay. A lot to talk about. I mean, this is a very short section of this chapter, but I might have more to talk about in these 5 verses than the whole rest of the chapter. Just really interesting stuff going on. So verse 41 here, the very first verse that was read, is very much a bookend to kind of our introduction to Elijah. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, this is when we first meet Elijah, this first recording of him in the Bible. It says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word.'" So those are the conditions. There's not going to be dew, there's not going to be rain, basically until I say so, until I say otherwise. And of course, that launches the events of that chapter. But then we come here to chapter 18, verse 41, and now Elijah says to Ahab, "Eat and drink, for there is the sound of heavy rain." Rain is imminent. It's on its way. So this drought that is occurring is about to end, is basically what he's telling him here. I like kind of focusing on that aspect because what Elijah said at the very outset is now coming to fruition. There's been no dew. There's been no rain. He says, "Until at my word, until I say so," and now he's saying so. So now rain is going to come, and we're going to see it does. So further, very much giving evidence to the power of God. As because Elijah is a prophet of God, and he's following what God is commanding him to do, God is very much showing he's in control of this entire situation. He says there's going to be no rain. There's no rain. He says, okay, now there's going to be rain. Okay, now there's going to be rain. So I just wanted to point that out there. And here's a question maybe, and we can probably talk about this. Why is Elijah telling Ahab to eat and drink? He says because the rain is coming. There's a sound of heavy rain approaching. But why would he tell Ahab to do this particular thing in this moment, to eat and drink?
Probably been rationing.
Okay, so maybe he's been rationing, maybe not getting a full meal.
And I think the emphasis is go eat, drink, fill yourself. Instead of eat and drink a small portion as you've been doing, go ahead and eat a complete normal, whatever meal or drink as much as you need to drink. Like Buddy said, I think it's just he's making a prediction here.
So, go ahead, Arnold.
Yeah, I was thinking that, okay, they've been without rain for years, so this is a time for almost like a feast to celebrate, get up, eat, drink, because things are about to change. So it's almost like, I guess, a joyous occasion about that.
Yeah, and we're kind of touching on it here and there. There's kind of two aspects that I want to focus on, and kind of the one that's been talked about more is when you are in drought, you do not eat as much as you can. You're trying to make sure you have enough to get by to the next day, because if you eat it all now, it's going to be gone. So there may have been some rationing going on, even in the king's palace. It's been 3.5 years of total drought. But it can also be a sign, seeing King Ahab eat and drink to the people means, okay, things are about to get better. We've just killed these 450 prophets of Baal. Now the prophet of God is telling the king to eat and drink, and not necessarily worry about make sure you got enough to get to X number of days. Strengthen yourself. Be at peace almost in a way, or no longer in such a tight situation or a sour situation, if you will. But it may be also for just practicality here. Think about what happens when there is no rain. What happens to the land? You got dirt. You don't have grass. In fact, we know they didn't have grass because they were looking for grass at the beginning of chapter 18. You don't have the vegetation that you need. So you're going to have dirt, dust. It's going to be desolate. And when you get a heavy rain in situations like that, you get mud. There is no easy way to get about that. So Ahab is going to have to ride hard to get out ahead of this storm. He's going to need his strength for the journey. So that may be a practical reason also, is Ahab, you got to be ready for this, because you're about to have a kind of a tough journey on your way back home here because of this heavy rain. Remember, they're out on Mount Carmel. They're not in a city, and he's got to travel back to civilization here before this storm hits him. So, and the timeline is a little bit vague about how this is exactly going, but that could be a reason for it. But things have changed. There's certainly a difference here. Whether it's, we need to change because, the situation is better and we don't need to worry about this, or, just practically you don't want to get stuck in the mud and the mire, because on a chariot, that's what's going to ruin you traveling. You're not going to get very far. In California, we had situations like this where you get years and years of hardly any rain, and then you get one solid, really good storm that comes down, and then you get mudslides, all in the hills. And, several times over the recent history, Interstate 5 has been basically blocked off by mud, and they had to clear it and rebuild parts of it, and it's just been a whole mess. And it doesn't, and this is modern technology, it still bothers us now. It's not like we have any way around it. So back then, certainly, he would have been at the mercy of the weather. So he tells Ahab to do that, and it seems that Ahab is probably going off to do that. And as he's doing that, Elijah returns to the summit of Mount Carmel, and he kneels down, and he's kneeling down in a very low, humble, prostrate way. He's so low that his head is between his knees, and my assumption on what he's doing here is he's praying. If you go to James chapter 5, which is near the very end of that book, James kind of recounts a little bit of Elijah's story here in talking about the power and the reason for prayer. If you look at James chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, he says, Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. So I think the assumption here, what Elijah is doing, is not just, he's tired and he's, taking a rest in a really weird position. I think he's praying is what, is going on here. So I think James kind of makes this more clear. This is what he's doing here at this moment. He's praying, and we're about to have this rain that's going to come up. So he's in this position, and it doesn't seem like he's getting up or looking around. He's staying here. He's got his head down, so he can't really see anything. And so he tells his servant, or I think some of your translations may say attendant, to go and to look over the sea. Now, again, this would be the Mediterranean Sea, were pretty close to the coastline. They would be visible from the summit of this mountain. My real question, well, maybe I'm going to get ahead of myself. But let's talk about the servant for a second. It was really common for prophets at this time, prophets of God, to have an attendant or servant who would kind of tend to their physical needs, help make sure they had food, make sure they had, all their things in line so that, they could focus on doing God's work while this attendant was taking care of their physical needs. We actually see this later on when Elisha starts following Elijah. That's kind of his job, is to do that. And Elisha himself, later on in 2 Kings, will have an attendant that will do things for him. When we have the story of Naaman, we'll see how that doesn't go so well for that servant because he kind of, shirks his duties a little bit in a way. We'll get to that when we get to that. But this is a common thing. This is not some weird thing that he's got a servant. The only thing is there's absolutely no mention of Elijah having a servant until just now. So we see Elijah, he appears on the scene in chapter 17. He's been by himself this entire time, so it seems. And I don't think this is like the situation we had when we were talking in our study of Abraham, where Abraham sends his servant out to go get a wife for Isaac. And we don't have any mention of anyone else until later in that chapter, and it talks about the men that were with him and all. But it makes it pretty clear that they were probably with him the whole time. And that's the assumption we can make from that, I think, without jumping through any major hoops or anything. But this is a little different. Because think about the story of Elijah thus far. He went to King Ahab, and then he said the bad news, hey, there's not going to be any rain. And then he goes to this little valley, this little ravine, and God is feeding him with ravens. There doesn't seem to be a second person around. It seems to just be Elijah. And then he's called to go up to the area of Sidon and Zarephath to this widow. And from all indications, it's just the widow, Elijah, and the widow's son. There's no mention of a fourth person there. So it's pretty clear he's by himself this entire time. So the question comes up, where'd this guy come from? And I like to bring up these questions because these are the questions that people that have issues with the Bible will say, well, this is an error, this is a mistake. He didn't have a servant. Why is he just appearing now? I don't think it's a bad thing for us to question, how can this be? I'm not going to say that Scripture is wrong that he had a servant there, but there isn't an explanation for why he's suddenly here after not being mentioned this entire time. So let's talk about some possible explanations. You may have not even thought of this. It may not have been a problem to you, but we're gonna investigate it anyway. So remember, Elijah probably has a bit of a tenure as a prophet before chapter 17 takes place. Obadiah, in fact, seems to recognize Elijah. There seems to be a history with them. So I don't think that Obadiah recognized Elijah from that one verse back in 17. He probably knew him before that. I don't usually see a person's face and 3.5 years later see that person again and be like, oh yeah, I remember you from 3.5 years ago that one time. Some people can do that. I can't. But he was probably a well-known prophet even before chapter 17 happened. So one assumption could be that he already had a servant, but that servant remained in Israel during that entire time. So when Elijah went and did his travels, he was by himself, and his attendant, his servant, had remained behind, not traveling with Elijah during those moments. Now, it could be that Elijah met up with his servant again sometime in chapter 18. This could be before he met up with Obadiah. So that would kind of place their reunion after 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 2, but before verse 7, because we don't know where Obadiah and Elijah met. We just know Obadiah and Ahab went separate ways, but we don't know exactly where Obadiah and Elijah were when they met. So it could be that Elijah first picked up a servant and then met Obadiah. We're not sure. Another window in time where this could have happened is if when Elijah tells Ahab to gather the people of Mount Carmel, there had to be a space of time for that to all take place because word would have to go out and then the people would have to travel to Mount Carmel. So there may have been some time where Elijah, had a rendezvous with his servant then and then went to Mount Carmel, or his servant met him there at some point. This is probably the most likely thing, is that he had a servant beforehand and is just now meeting up with him again, that he's just been absent away from him this entire time. It also could be that maybe you get someone who volunteered immediately after the events of Mount Carmel. They saw what Elijah had done. They were part of that group that was there when they slaughtered the 450 prophets of Baal, and then he decided he was going to work for Elijah after that, just spurned by the events that have happened. We don't see that in Scripture. I feel like there would have been detail if that happened. It's still possible it could have happened. I don't get the feeling that that's necessarily the case, but those are certainly some possibilities. So I wouldn't say that this is a mistake or an error. Certainly not impossible. It's just we're not given these details. But those are some possibilities of where that servant could have come from. In fact, probably most of you will never worry about this detail again. It's not a big deal. In fact, we get pretty early on in chapter 19, this servant's going to go away. He's not going to be around Elijah anymore. He's really only mentioned for this one moment to kind of help us understand how these events took place at the end of chapter 18. That really seems to be the only reason he's mentioned at all. So not a very important figure. I don't think it's an issue. So when you have people argue, well, the Bible can't be true because of this servant guy who's mentioned all of a sudden without any background, it's just the background of him is not mentioned. It doesn't mean it's an impossibility. It's just we're not told. And I've already told you there's some possibilities of where he could have come from. There could be more possibilities, but I think those are possibly the most likely. That's a tangent. That's probably not important. So I'm going to leave that alone unless anyone has a comment on that. So let's go ahead and move on. So he tells his servant to go look over the sea, and he does. He goes and he looks over the Mediterranean Sea. He comes back and reports that, well, there's nothing there, Elijah. I don't see anything. And Elijah tells him to go back and look 7 times. Now, I've tried to look at this many different ways in several different translations, and I don't like the wording of it. I mean, it's another detail, I guess, that doesn't matter, but I like those. I can't tell if this is the servant was told to go and look 7 times, or he was told to go and look, he came back, and then an additional 7 times he was told to go look. So I don't know if that total is 7 or 8, because the wording is a little bit vague, and maybe some of your translations will make it easier or less easy to understand. Especially when we get into numerology, we'll say, oh, it has to be 7 because 7 is that perfect number, and that's the way God would have wanted it. But then, I can go to some other verses where you have 7, indicating perfect or perfection or completeness, and then you have 7 plus 1 mentioned in some sort of prophecy indicating greater than completion or greater than perfection. So I could go either way on it. Again, it's a detail that doesn't really matter, but it's certainly something that's interesting. But regardless, the last time the servant returns, he says in his report that there's a small cloud like a man's hand rising from the sea. So there's a cloud appearing, something is coming from the sea. So upon hearing this, Elijah tells his servant to go and tell Ahab. Elijah's not going himself. He's telling his servant to go to Ahab and to tell Ahab to get in his chariot and, get going because there's a storm coming and it's going to get him if he doesn't stay ahead of it. So he's telling him to hitch up your chariot, get going. Now's the time. Don't wait around. We kind of talked about this a little bit already, but apparently Ahab is still in the area of Mount Carmel. Otherwise, the servant would have not been able to tell him this. Maybe he's still eating and drinking. I'm not sure how long that would have gone. But Ahab certainly would have had difficulty in traveling in a storm, in a chariot, on terrain that has no vegetation at all, would easily be rained out. You don't want to be on any sort of terrain when this kind of heavy storm happens. It could be potentially very dangerous. And this is sort of, I think, God's way of showing some mercy to Ahab, because Ahab has not been a good king. We've talked about Ahab's problems, and there's going to be more. He's not a good king, and yet God still has, some mercy for him. He's got more things he wants to show Ahab. He's got a plan here. So he's going to let Ahab know, okay, now's the time to get out of the way because bad things are about to approach here. So you got to get out ahead of the storm. Don't get caught in it. Don't get stuck. Don't be in that danger. So I think there's a little bit of mercy going on here to Ahab. And we'll see a little more of this through Ahab's life. But we've kind of talked about the end of it is Ahab never really seems to come around like other figures do, like Nebuchadnezzar, who seems to really understand after a lot of instances that, hey, this God of Daniel, he's the real God. Ahab never seems to really get a grasp on that in the same way. So it seems that the rain is beginning to maybe start as Ahab is riding off to Jezreel in his chariot. Now, Jezreel is a city that would be located south. What did I put in my notes? I put south. Oh, no, I put southeast. Okay. Thought for a second I wrote it wrong. Jezreel would be southeast of Mount Carmel, about 20 miles. But that's like if you did a straight shot, no moving around terrain. And we know he's on Mount Carmel, so he's going to have a little bit of a time getting down off the mountain. And then he's got to travel across the Jezreel Valley to get there. So it's probably going to be a little bit more than 20 miles, but it's about 20 miles straight shot from one location to the other. There's a lot of variables that we could put in there, but that's about the distance. So he's heading off, and the interesting thing here in this last part, it says, the power of the Lord comes upon Elijah, and he gets himself all tied up and ready to go, and he's able to run ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Now, this is probably another thing where it's not that interesting a detail, but we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about this one part because I find it fascinating. I think if we put this in context, we really realize how miraculous this little moment is. So if you ever are asked, who's the world's fastest man, I've got an interesting answer for you here. So I did some math. Unfortunately, it was late at night. I probably shouldn't have done so much, but here's what I found out. I wanted to find out how fast Elijah was running because we kind of know the trajectory, we know the distance, we know where they're going from and to, and we have a few extra variables that kind of give us some clues into that. So Ahab's in his chariot, right? And Elijah is running at least faster than Ahab because he gets to Jezreel ahead of Ahab. In fact, it even looks like maybe Ahab had a head start because he's told ahead of time by Elijah's servant to get up and go. So maybe he even had a head start of Elijah, but Elijah still beats him there. So the question we really have to ask now is how fast does this chariot go? Because if we don't know that, we can't measure the comparison. So records of Roman chariot racing in the Circus Maximus arena indicates that they could reach top speeds of 40 miles per hour, which for a horse is extremely fast. Even if they're not pulling something, that's really fast. But you got to consider the Circus Maximus arena was built specifically for chariot racing. That's one of its main purposes. So they're going to have the terrain perfect. It's going to, like if you had a NASCAR track, you're going to have that pavement just the way you want it just for those cars. So it was perfect conditions, flat, easy, lots of strong horses, but short periods of time when they're running compared to this. These horses were not running 40 miles per hour for 20 miles. There's no way a horse could physically do that. So that's not probably the best comparison, but if you look this up, that's probably the first thing that's going to pop up. That's why I'm mentioning it. Older ancient Egyptian chariots have been studied, and according to one professor, Bella Sandor, who is a professor emeritus at the engineering physics of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, believes that those Egyptian chariots could reach top speeds of 25 miles per hour. So considerably slower than those later Roman counterparts, but still pretty fast. And again, these are top speeds, so not sustained over long periods of time. So maybe still not quite a good comparison. I doubt that Ahab's horses would be running at that full speed at that amount of distance. But it's probably a closer comparison as far as the chariot goes. The other comparison is stagecoaches. Stagecoach horses could usually travel a pace of about 15 to 20 miles per hour, assuming they were in prime condition and they were changed out regularly. They're not running full speed the entire time, but they could, probably have reached from Carmel to Jezreel. And I mean, if you had direct 20 miles per hour, flat terrain, perfect, they can make it in maybe an hour or close to. We're not probably in perfect terrain here, so it's probably going to take Ahab a little bit longer. He's probably not going quite that fast, but that's probably the closest thing we can compare it to. So I could say maybe he's going, maximum of 20 miles per hour, maybe a little bit slower, but probably that's pretty close, 15 to 20 miles per hour. Now, for further context, the fastest sprinters in the world on foot can run over 27 miles per hour. That's pretty fast, but also very short distance. They're not running 20 miles over that time. So that's a short distance. It's not very good a comparison. So I wanted to look at the marathon runners. Of course, the marathon is 26.2 miles. So that's a pretty comparable distance. And the fastest runners of the marathon in history, they do not really exceed a pace more than 13 miles per hour, which is still incredibly fast. I'll never be able to do that. I'm not saying, this is slow. It's slower than the comparison, but it's the fastest humans can possibly go at such a distance. So 13 miles per hour, that would be about the fastest that you could do this. But even so, that's not going to get you faster than Ahab's chariot. He's probably going 15 to 20 miles per hour, maybe a little faster at times. But there should be no way, even if Elijah was the world's best marathon runner, he would never be able to outrun Ahab's chariot here to get to Jezreel. So therefore, Ahab's chariot was outpaced by Elijah, so Elijah is probably going faster than any human in history at that distance. Now, there are certainly some, there's a lot of margin of error here, but I think it's pretty clear that this is not humanly possible, which is why I like that this verse includes the power of the Lord came upon Elijah to do this, because otherwise you'd have people going here again saying, well, the Bible can't be right because, this is physically impossible. And they're right, it is physically impossible, but God is doing this. Now, we don't see really anything like this anywhere else in the Bible where someone is, given intense powers of speed on foot, although I suppose we could argue for some, but this is probably the clearest example of it. Again, probably something you didn't care about, but here is God doing another miracle in just one verse here that we probably just pass over. It's just a little detail, but this is something that is amazing. So just in chapter 18 by itself, you have God raining down fire from heaven. That fire licks up something that's been doused with water. The water itself is taken up. The stones and the earth are taken up. That's not how fire works. So that's miraculous. You have Elijah praying and rain coming back upon the land when there's been a miraculous drought of 3.5 years. And then you have Elijah now running faster than any human has in history ahead of Ahab over about a distance of 20 miles to Jezreel. So it's amazing all these things that have happened here. And I'm sure these things were not unknown, especially the things that the people of Israel were gathered for, the fire from heaven, all that stuff. And yet there is no change in Israel. This is the real sad part about this situation. And it's not just Elijah. It's not Elijah's fault. It's not that he's not charismatic enough to convince people. This is the story of Israel and Judah until the time of captivity. Is God over and over is showing them miraculous things that could possibly not have happened, saving them in so many ways, and yet the people don't get it. Maybe you have a generation that's like, okay, God saved us, we're going to serve him from now on, but that generation goes away, the next generation comes, and that's lost. It's really tough to see this, and kind of sad in a way, but it also kind of teaches us some things where we get people who argue with us and say, well, if God was so great and if he was real, he'd reveal himself. Well, he has, and I could make a whole thing about that. Could be its old lesson right there. But even that doesn't change people's minds. If they're not willing to submit, if they don't want to follow the Lord, they're just not going to do it. People will get hard-hearted like that. And we see so many examples in the Bible of that. We are out of time, so I'm glad you enjoyed these 5 verses. I was not expecting it to take this long until I did. Any comments, anything else on chapter 18? This is where we're going to stop. We'll move on to chapter 19 next week. But go ahead, Arnold.
The fact that Ahab was spared and told to go ahead and get back to at least Jezreel shows that God also used him as a bearer of things that happened while they were away. So that he could be
Yeah, and who's going to argue with them? Well, I got one person who's going to argue. Then we'll talk about it next week in chapter 19. And again, and that's going to be kind of the flip side of this is when we get to chapter 19. Again, everything should be right now. Everything should be turned around. Everyone should be like, okay, we're serving the Lord now. And that's not at all what happens. We're going to see kind of the influence of Jezebel here and how far that goes in chapter 19 and how that affects Elijah. And we're going to talk about it next week, but I'll kind of mention it here before we finish. Elijah has been, with God this entire time. God says, go do this. He goes and does it. There's no discussion. There's no argument. There's no questions. He just does it. But we're going to see starting in chapter 19, that changes. Chapter 19, Elijah is going to start questioning God, saying, God, you don't know what you're doing. Why are we doing this? Things are not going well. Elijah really has some heart-to-heart conversations with God. And it's easy to be hard on Elijah about that, but I think there's some real despair from Elijah going on. We're going to talk about it next week, but note that when we start next week, kind of the sentiment between Elijah and God and just Elijah and the people is going to change extremely, in a great extreme. But we'll stop there. I'm over time. So we'll begin in chapter 19 next week. Thank you for your time. Sorry it took so much time on 5 verses.